The lack of law and order during the war meant that for the British and Irish capitalist class, Sinn Féin came to be seen as a way of returning to business as normal. If the forces of the British Crown could no longer guarantee the law and order needed to keep business as usual, perhaps the IRA could play that role. So Sinn Féin started to prove that it could be trusted to manage capitalism in Southern Ireland on May 17th, 1920, a very specific date, and that's because it's the first public arbitration court is held on that date. And this fines against smallholders who had occupied a 100-acre farm. Although the smallholders defied the court decision, they refused to leave the occupation. In the words of a Dáil pamphlet at the time, the captain of the local company of the IRA descended upon them with a squad of his men, sons of very poor farmers like themselves, arrested 4 of them and brought them off to that very effective Republican prison, an unknown destination. Pat O'Donnell, another OC officer commanding of this time of the 2nd Brigade of the IRA, wrote in 1963 that many an IRA man in jail in 22 and 23 cursed his use as a defender of pure ideals to patrol estate walls, enforce decrees for rent, arrest, and even order out of the country leaders of local land agitation. So in effect, the IRA demonstrated that it could protect the rich in a way that the RIC, the police force, were no longer capable of doing. And this was Irish republicanism at its most militant period. It's also simultaneously a period when Irish workers were at the most militant. We've never seen a wave of struggle like that since. 80 workplace occupations calling themselves Soviets in that time period. But the direct action of these workers was seen by the Republican leadership as a hindrance to the Republican struggle, something that threatened unity. Breaking these workers' struggles was the way the Dáil won the allegiance of a large section of Irish capitalism. It demonstrated that, unlike the British state, it could maintain law and order and protect the property and land of the wealthy from the working class. And I think if you want to understand how come the War of Independence resulted in Britain pulling out of part of Ireland, that's the way to understand it, rather than as some sort of military victory, which is often as it's portrayed. So far in that account, I haven't talked about what was happening in the northeast of Ireland, the area with the Protestant majority. The treaty that ended the war saw Ireland partitioned, with the 6 counties of North East Ulster being given home rule as part of the UK. And partition happened for 2 reasons. The first is imperialist self-interest. Partition meant they held on to the heavy industry, and particularly the shipbuilding around Belfast that was located in the north, along with military and naval bases, which gave them control over the North Atlantic, and they're particularly important in terms of the Second World War. But the second reason was that the population of most of the northeast was majority Protestant, and one of the most negative consequences of the Gaelic revival, which created this cross-class Catholic nationalist alliance in the south, was it drove northern Protestant workers further into the waiting arms of the northern bosses. Sectarian competition for work and housing, in particular in Belfast, had become really acute. There were periodic violent rioting and workplace pogroms where Catholic and left workers were driven out of the workplaces. And in particular, the shipyards, this happens about once every decade in the years between 1860 and 1920. But just as there were class tensions within Southern nationalism, so too these existed within Northern loyalism. The syndicalist wave also arrived in the north, leading to very significant strikes in 1907, when even the police went out and strike, a pretty unusual thing, and in 1919, when the strike committee issued permits as to which companies could use electricity in Belfast. So somewhat similar to what was happening in the south. Even companies were forced to pay real attention to the strike committee. Despite this militancy, which paralleled the militancy among workers in the south, there's almost no significant cooperation between these two workers' movements. And that's kind of amazing, because Ireland's a pretty small place. I mean, Belfast and Dublin are about 100 miles apart. Back then, you could get a train from one to the other in about an hour and a half. But there's almost no link, there's almost no contact between these two militant workers' movements. Post-partition, we end up with 2 reactionary, clerical-dominated states who cemented their positions by going after anyone who didn't quite fit in. In the south, for instance, most of the famous authors associated with Irish literature had one or more of their books banned, and many actually moved abroad in this period. The Protestant minority in the south was small, and probably halved in the 10 years following partition, so the southern state could develop as a strongly Catholic in nature, but it could afford to be somewhat tolerant of the tiny Protestant minority. In the north, you had a very different situation, where the Catholic minority is quite large, and the Unionist state found it necessary to exclude Catholics from power through various means, and to construct a purely Protestant militia to back up the police force. The Catholic minority found itself excluded from jobs, from housing, and from power, and that pretty much made the revolt that took place at the end of the 1960s almost inevitable. As the state tried to physically crush that revolt, you saw a return of traditional armed force nationalism to physically defend Catholic areas and to take the war to the other side. And then massive British military intervention that led to the 30-plus years of low-intensity war, which ended in the mid-1990s with the peace process. Now, I don't actually talk so much about that because I think a lot of the actual problems within Irish nationalism and also the potential are visible earlier on. The more recent situation was much messier. That brings us to our current moment in time. We're now 90 years on from partition, which pretty much means no one living can in fact really claim to remember it. The North is ruled by an alliance of Republicans and Unionists under a peace process that has copper-fastened the sectarian divisions at the price of as the price to pay for moving towards the rolling up of the economic and cultural oppression of the Catholic population. So essentially, although you've got something that's a lot closer to equality now, you've also got a system that guarantees that it's very hard to break away from that, to break out of the sectarian divisions. In the South at the moment, imperialist intervention means that now, imperialist intervention in the South today is carried out by ECB, IMF accountants armed with laptops. As you're probably aware, we've an absolutely crazy financial crisis going on here with the IMF intervention there before Christmas. So it's accountants that we face rather than British soldiers with guns. That's not necessarily any less deadly. The health cuts that have been used to pay for the bank bailouts in particular are certainly killing more people on a day-to-day basis than died at the height of the war in the North. So I think the challenge for those of us, for anarchists in Ireland, is to create an anarchist anti-imperialist politics that can analyse and combat these two very new situations that we actually face, both North and South. And in some ways that parallels the situation elsewhere internationally.